Hello, Juan Manuel. Can you hear me?
Hello, Mr. Mayor. How are you? I called you Mr. Mayor because you do know that every year in every mayoral election, you get a few votes as a writing candidate for mayor. You got 4, I checked. The last time around in 2021, you got 7 in 2019. How does it feel?
It's pretty hilarious. I see it every year because I look at all those write-in votes anyway, and I have no idea who does it. The joke that I tell on the radio is, yeah, I got 4 write-in votes for mayor. That means 2 people other than my parents. But my parents definitely do not write me in for mayor.
From Columbia Journalism School in New York City, this is Juan Manuel Benitez Wants to Know. He is the mayor of New York City Radio. It sounds like a joke until you realize that Brian Lehrer has governed the daily civic conversation on WNYC longer than any other City Hall leader. And yes, I want to know what Brian thinks of this year's election, but also get a little deeper into the life of this legendary and very private broadcaster. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Hi, Juan Manuel. Always great to see you.
So, Brian, who should we vote for this year?
You know I can't say that. I work for a 501c3 not-for-profit, and we are prohibited by law from saying who we endorse. Not that I would really want to do that anyway, given the role that I play.
But you are one of those journalists who doesn't vote, or you do exercise that right?
I do vote.
Sometimes I wonder whether the exercise of voting is more an emotional act than a rational act. Sometimes I think about us journalists, we interview all the candidates, so we have all the information. But for some reason, every time I think about this democratic exercise that we do every certain time, I think emotion drives this vote more than my reason. Is that an assessment that you agree with?
That I would very much agree with. And in fact, it's one of the dilemmas in a way that I feel like I deal with as a host of a show that deals primarily in issues. So like we're in our what we call 30 issues in 30 days election series, right? 30 straight shows where we do an issue a day relative to, in this case, either the New York Mayoral Race or the New Jersey gubernatorial race, which we're also covering. But those issues are presented very much in a way to compare the candidates on how they would try to improve the public schools or what they would do about energy prices or, you know, whatever the thing is. And yet we know that people don't sit with a mental calculator and think about it in the way that, frankly, I tend to. People have gut reactions to how this candidate looks or how that candidate presents, or if they've said something about someone a person considers a political bad guy that pushes a button in an emotional way. You probably know there was a lot of conversation last year during the presidential debate about how it was a post-policy debate, whether people considered that because it was a cult of personality, quote unquote, regarding Trump and his fan base, or, you know, or other things. But yes, that's a long answer to your question. I do think about it being an emotional thing as opposed to a kind of rational compare the policies thing.
Some voters might be voting on hope or excitement, or maybe they find the candidate charming, or fear. That is a tool that many candidates use against their opponents.
Right. And so fear could be related to bias. One of the late night comics, I think, and yes, there is still late night comedy on television for the moment. Somebody was saying the other day, oh, Kamala Harris has a memoir out. I don't know what the title is, but when you read the book, the title should be, I Lost Because I'm a Black Woman. And yet there is certainly an element of, if you say fear, some people may just not trust somebody who looks like her if they come from that background, or identify more. And that's an emotional thing with the candidate from whatever background. is the same as them or that for whatever reason they trust. So, yeah, that's another piece of it.
So this year, should New Yorkers fear socialism?
Well, that's for them to judge. I think part of the role that we're trying to play is to explore socialism and what it is in the context of Zohran Mamdani and the mayoral race in the United States. We had one anti-Mamdani candidate. We've been doing a lot of debates in our 30 issues in 30 days. In one, we had a Republican who came originally from the Soviet Union and said, well, Mamdani is a socialist. I know what that is because I came to this country from the Soviet Union. So at least a follow-up question had to be, well, he's not proposing to turn the United States into the Soviet Union. He would probably say more like the democratic socialist countries in Scandinavia, where the happiness, there are these international measures of happiness, and they always rate much higher than the United States. But then it's still up to voters to decide if they want to compare us to Scandinavia, or if they take that particular guest's warning that there's a slippery slope. And if you start going down that slope, it's going to lead to Soviet Union, it's going to lead to Maduro's Venezuela or something like that. So it's for people to decide, but it's for us to give it a proper, not oversimplified context.
You're one of the best informed people in the city, not only because I know that you read a lot and you read the news and books, but also because for your job every day, you have to talk to a lot of average New Yorkers calling into the show. So you do have the pulse of the city. So what is that New Yorkers right now are yearning or looking for in a mayor?
Well, I do think affordability, which everybody's running on, is so key. It's not anything, that people are going to learn from me when I say housing affordability is probably the number one issue. Um, and you can see it on the candidates' websites. Some of this reading that I do that you referred to is I've been trying to look at the three candidates' websites with sort of a fine tooth iPad and to see what issues they're focusing on and how they're different from each other on the various issues. Well, they all start with big affordability sections of their websites and using that word. So obviously, there's a consensus out there that affordability is an issue. And housing, obviously, the price of food, which went up a lot during the pandemic, and blame who you will, but it did. Energy utility prices are spiking recently, and so there are debates about that. So yeah, clearly affordability, always public safety. And part of the historical context here that you well know is, despite New York being blue New York, Democratic New York, New York City voters have a history of electing more conservative mayors when public safety rises to the top of their concerns. So if we go back like 30 years, 1993, 32 years ago, obviously Rudy Giuliani was elected largely because of that, served 2 terms. Then Mayor Bloomberg won 3 times over well-known liberal Democrats or progressive Democrats each time. And then, yes, we had 2 terms of de Blasio. But then in 2021, where the real competition was in the Democratic primary, the relatively conservative and public safety hawk candidate, Eric Adams, won the primary and was elected mayor. So, yes, public safety, yes, affordability. I think those are 1 and 2.
And as journalists, we are lucky, fortunate enough to meet these candidates in person. So everybody hears what they have to say about the issues, what their plans are for the city. But we get that face to face sometimes opportunity. We get to feel them as people. How would you describe the three main candidates? For example, what's your feeling about Curtis Sliwa personally, not politically?
Well, I mean, I don't have enough contact with him over the years to have an opinion about him or really any of them personally in the way that I think you mean it. I mean, I get a vibe from them. Um,
And what is that
but,
vibe?
but I think the vibe has really to do with a political context. So, I mean, Curtis Sliwa started his public life as, the founder of the Guardian Angels, doing this sort of private citizen street patrol, and some people labeled him as a vigilante and um, maybe more hardcore. And he's probably softened over time. You see his softer side now, whether it's his focus on animal rights or just sort of the way he comes off and tries to be a bigger tent person and express more empathy with with different individuals, different populations than maybe he did originally. Zohran Mamdani comes out of movement politics, but he also comes from this very educated and creative family background. He's one of the few candidates for anything, or one of the few guests of any kind I've ever had on the show where I can say I also interviewed his iconic mother. In this case, the filmmaker Mira Nair, when she was on for one of her films a number of years ago. But then when I thought about that, I thought, oh, another one like that is Andrew Cuomo, because I had interviewed his iconic father, Mario Cuomo. So Zohran Mamdani comes from this particular background, which gives him a certain intellectual as well as emotional relationship with the world. And he is, I think, sort of um, what's the word? A thoughtful enough person. Just as I was giving Sliwa credit for being maybe more thoughtful than people would have thought of him as being some years ago. Mamdani's a thoughtful enough person that he really is listening, from the way it appears to me, to people who disagree with him, and trying to bring people into his tent, not by shouting him down. It's sort of the opposite vibe of what Trump does, let's say, right? Which is not a judgment. It's just Trump is just trying to build his base largely on showing how angry he is at people who he thinks are doing the country wrong. Mamdani is trying to build his base by reaching out and reaching out and reaching out and saying, I hear you, but also sticking mostly to here's what I think. And Andrew Cuomo, probably sort of the coolest of the three, in the cool to hot kind of spectrum, and I don't know what he's like behind the scenes in this respect, but his public persona is he's he's cool. He knows what he thinks now. He's got all this experience. He's very confident. That's part of the coolness. He's very confident in his ability to run things with the many experiences that he's had. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's some of my judgment of who they are as people.
It definitely does. And I do know, if I'm not mistaken, that David Dinkins was the first mayor of New York that you interviewed.
But I mean, unless you consider Ed Koch, but I didn't interview him until after he was out of office.
Gotcha. So the first mayor you interviewed while in office was David Dinkins. But I'm curious to know, you are born and raised in New York City, in Queens. Who is the first mayor of the city that you remember?
Mayor Wagner is the first name, and he was mayor for a long time. Was he 3 terms also? I think so. Um, like Koch and Bloomberg, but I feel like my whole childhood, or a lot of my childhood, it was Mayor Wagner, Mayor Wagner, Mayor Wagner. But I had very not much of an impression of Mayor Wagner. I just knew Mayor Wagner. And then, though, came John Lindsay, who I had more of an impression of as this guy who was trying to come in as something new and progressive in 1965 when I was 13 years old, and 1969 when he was reelected. I had an impression of, and as a kid thinking, oh, wow, interesting. Yeah, Mayor Wagner was sort of gray to me, and John Lindsay was a little bit larger than life and seeming to be interesting and trying to bring what from a kid in the 60s perspective in Queens was maybe positive change. Not that I was old enough to vote. So that those are the two from what I would consider my childhood. Although I will say that in the 1969 mayoral election, my father took me to hear a campaign appearance by Norman Mailer, who was running as an independent candidate, or was it in the Democratic primary? I'm not sure which, with Jimmy Breslin, the legendary columnist, as his running mate. So I got a very, you know, interesting dose of a kind of progressive anger that was different from the kind of progressive hope and change candidate that John Lindsay was trying to be.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that young man growing up in Queens and the city that you grew up in?
Yeah. Both my parents grew up in the South Bronx, poor in the South Bronx. They met as teenagers and married when they were 20 years old. They recently celebrated their 77th wedding anniversary by the way.
Wow, congratulations.
So they grew up poor in the South Bronx. They both went to City College for free at the time. After my father was in the Army, he went a little after my mother. And they and he was an engineering major, and my mother was an education major. She became a public school teacher, and he became an electrical engineer, then electronics engineer. And so they started to have a middle class life and moved to an apartment in Queens, in Whitestone, Queens. That's where I got my first political experience that I remember, being 8 years old, sitting with my mother and watching on our black and white television a Kennedy-Nixon debate. And I don't remember anything about it content-wise or my mother's reactions, but it was a thing, and she was really interested. And it left an impression on me as something interesting. And so that was my first little formative political experience. And then they eventually had enough money to move to a house a little ways away in Bayside. My basically middle school and high school years were spent there, getting by in school. I was an okay student, wasn't a great student, and playing as much stickball in the schoolyard as I could. And that's in a nutshell the beginning.
Back in May, you got an award here at the Columbia Journalism School for your work as a journalist and as a top broadcaster in local news in the city. And you told the students, fall in love with local news. Local news needs you. What do you mean by that? And what kind of love does local news need at this moment?
I'm glad you read the transcript of the speech, or however you got that, or maybe that line just made an impression with you because I know you were there. And yeah, I mean, I think, I can even relate it back to what I said about my first political moment watching a Nixon Kennedy debate. That was obviously national news, and national news is very compelling. Obviously, national news today is very compelling. And for somebody who's interested in journalism, the temptation or the attraction might be, oh, I want to go and report on Trump, or I want to go and report on, Israel Palestine, or that kind of thing. Of course, it's it takes a whole other level of risk if you're actually going to report in a war zone, but that's a different conversation. But it's like national politics are really compelling. And, maybe you watch CNN or Fox or MSNBC, whatever your choice if you're watching television anymore, or the podcasts. I also mentioned in that speech, I don't know if you picked up on it, just promoting the idea of these journalism graduates going into actual journalism, that here we are at a moment in the country where we are dividing up increasingly into, I said, our Charlie Kirk or Hassan Piker echo chambers, right? To cite those very opinionated podcasters. And of course, that was before the assassination of Charlie Kirk,
Mhm.
made him much more of a household name to people outside that echo chamber than he was before. But my argument was, go into journalism if you can and go beyond that. But that's what's so compelling to people. Let's say those kinds of social media content makers. And so much of that is national, to divide up into your friends and enemies camps. Local news is more granular. It's more personal, because you're reporting on your neighbors and what they need, whether, and of course, neighbors writ large. You still have to get out of your bubble. If you're, let's say, relatively affluent and live on the Upper West Side and you're a journalist, get your butt out to East New York or places like that, so you have actual reporting experience. But it's also the crisis of journalism's centerpiece. That's where profits have been lost so much, that so many local news organizations all over the country have gone out of business. And so local news needs you. Anybody watching this or listening to this who's maybe a young aspiring journalist or considering going into journalism, that's where the need is local news.
How is it working for public radio today, Brian?
Well, it's working and it's not working. I guess the implication of your question is, we just had the loss of 100% of our federal funding for
Mhm.
every public radio station in the system. Working for WNYC in New York, I have the privilege, and we have the privilege, um, of being a radio station in the largest city in the country that has a potential and actual large donor base. So if we are meaningful to people in the community, that's a lot of people in the community who can be members in our membership drives. And so the percentage of our station's budget, I'm not saying anything that isn't already public information, the percentage of our budget that was federal funding is relatively small. It's a few percent, single digits. For small public radio stations around the country, where there aren't that many people and they don't have the potential for as many members, their federal funding share was much larger. And there are stations around the country that are going through literally existential crises right now. In fact, one of the things that we're doing at WNYC, even as we're absorbing our own losses, and we really do have losses, I mean, even at single digit percent, it's still a few $1 million that we have to figure out what not to spend money on or raise it some other way. We're developing a consortium with other public radio institutions around the country to help build a public radio infrastructure that will help everybody. And one ways that my employer is WNYC is doing that is, we produce some national shows as well as the local ones like mine. The national ones, New Yorker Radio Hour, On the Media, Radio Lab, that hundreds of public radio stations, I believe is the number, carry. And, usually there's a fee that they pay to carry these shows that we produce. so that we can afford to produce them. And that fee is being waived for the moment for stations that are in economic distress. So that's, a few data points of how, for us in a relatively privileged position, still with a few $1,000,000 to make up, but compared to and linking with other more vulnerable radio stations around the country, that's a little bit of the scene.
On the Brian Lehrer show, you always lead a very measured, thoughtful, calm conversation. But given what's happening right now, politically, in this country, do you think journalists have the responsibility of pulling the fire alarm if they really care about the democratic system?
Yes, and you may have noticed that this was one of the tensions that I spoke about in that Columbia Grad School of Journalism commencement address. And it's a tension that I feel, and I don't have a easy sort of answer to it, like, here's the right way. But I think describing the tension is, is useful because it's a matter of the process. On the one hand, we want to have multiple points of view, right? Obviously. People accuse journalists sometimes of falling into both sidesism, right? And I say, well, I'm for both sidesism as much as possible, beyond both sidesism, multiple sidesism. I'm for multiple sidesism, except that I understand that what the term both sidesism means as a critique really has to do with a false equivalency. When there's a false equivalency, but you present the one false side as in debate with the true side so that you create an impression of balance, which might be to pander to that part of the population that believes the false side, right? So I hope that's clear, but that's kind of my understanding of what bad both sidesism is. But I want to have as many multiple points of view segments on the show as humanly possible. At the same time, when there's bullshit, we have an obligation to call out bullshit. And so the tension is, where is that line? And who am I to judge? And so we're always feeling for that line. I think we can say definitively that the 2020 election was not stolen. And to call that a lie and not continue to have debates about whether the 2020 election was stolen, because they had their opportunity, the Trump side, in 60 or so different court cases that they brought, and really never presented any evidence that the election was stolen. They made arguments that certain kinds of voting and things like that could make an election more vulnerable to fraud, but they never presented any evidence that the election was stolen. And so that's just one clear example of where we just have to call it out. But that's the tension that I think a thoughtful journalist is going to experience over and over again.
Brian, what are you reading for fun these days?
Oh, for fun, I'm reading the novel The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, which is, I mean, it's fun, but it's a novel very steeped in contemporary issues as well.
Do you listen to any podcasts?
I listen to a little bit of a lot of things. I probably listen to things that are obvious. I listen to my own station's podcast, political podcasts that will feed what I do, Slate Political Gabfest, some New York Times podcasts, some of these real echo chambery ones, be it Charlie Kirk previously or Hassan Piker, to give those examples. Because I want to know, they have a lot of those kinds of things, have a lot of viewers or listeners. And So I feel like it's my responsibility to keep up.
And something that you miss about the New York City of the past.
I'm trying to look for the right word. It's not the grittiness exactly. You know, even this comes down to affordable housing, um, because there was the time when people who wanted to make it in the arts would flock to New York and they could find cheap housing. And I guess young professionals are still moving to New York, young artistic people are still moving to New York, but it's so hard. I don't think it's happening in the way that it was in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, because it's just so hard to afford to live right now.
And I know that you live in Inwood. Is there a park that you go back every time you need some time alone? Is it Fort Tryon Park?
Well, it's in Wood Hill Park primarily, which I'm lucky enough to live close to, and I think it's such a jewel. I feel very blessed to have discovered Inwood years ago, moved here 20 years ago, and so happy here. And one of the reasons is it's definitely the city. You know, I like city life. I like urban life. I like pedestrian and subway commuting life, not sort of suburban car life. So I like living in the city that way. I like living among diversity and not homogeneity in terms of people. You know, I like living in buildings, really. I like having neighbors in an apartment building more than I think I would like living in a house on a block. That's just me. So, you know, and the shops and restaurants and all of this stuff that makes the city, access to the arts. But I also love greenery, and Inwood Hill Park is so spectacular and sprawling. I tell people, and they don't believe me, that I live in the city in Manhattan in a place where I can walk a few blocks and I can walk in the woods up and down switchbacks if I choose to. And so between that and just the open green areas of Inwood Hill Park and the ball fields where you can watch, they have the sweetest little league field in Inwood Hill Park where the little kids play in this really fenced in area. My kid played in Inwood Little League. And, when I'm out running, which I do for exercise, I love to run by the Little League field and just watch as I go by, make that part of my route I'm running around in a circle to see the little kids playing organized ball in the just one of the features of Inwood Hill Park, along with all the others.
Going back to your show, because I know that your show is one of the hardest jobs in journalism. I know because I've done it. I guess hosted your show. You have an amazing production team, but you require a lot of concentration. You're not only reading and listening to your producers in your ear, but also you have New Yorkers calling in, and you have to decide who is going to talk or ask a question, and it's a live show, and it requires a lot of preparation as well. So you've been doing this since 1989, the Brian Lehrer Show. Have you ever hosted your show while you were going through a very difficult time in your life?
Sure. When you do something for 36 years, you are going to inevitably run into difficult times in your life while you're doing it. Mostly during those times, the show has been an outlet. And not that I was talking about difficult times in my personal life, but, you know, a distraction in the sense that I was able to immerse myself back in the tasks at hand of doing the show or the issues of the larger world outside whatever my personal stuff might be been at difficult times in my life. And so I found it uh, more to be, um, you know, something that helped me cope rather than was an extra burden.
And when in 50 years, in 2075, someone goes back to the WNYC archives and listens to the Brian Lehrer show, what would you like that person, that New Yorker, to take away from it?
Nobody will do that. All the
You
news
never know. You
will
never
have
know,
been
Brian.
so moved on by then. No, who knows? Maybe somebody will. But I, I guess I hope that they would find something that was produced in good faith to try to welcome people with different points of view on things and really different life experiences. You know, that's one of the gratifying things about hosting a call-in show where you do get people from different kinds of backgrounds, whether that's economic backgrounds or political backgrounds, racial and ethnic backgrounds, whatever, sharing their experiences where, and not just the professional politicians and analysts, but where other people who are not them can hear it. So I hope they will find something that tried to do that in good faith, and I hope they'll find that they heard some artful improv. You know, you were talking about the things, and you've been great when you've sub-hosted the show, by the way. But some of the things that we're juggling at the same time. Yes, I'm dealing with information that I've studied up on for whoever the guest is, at the same time that I'm looking at a computer screen that has usually 10 different callers. We have 10 lines who want to say different things and a little tiny summary in each box of
Hmm.
what those things are, and figuring out in conjunction with the director of the show who's in my ear, where we might go next. And these days we also have a text message thread.
Hmm.
uh, you know, we used to use a comments page, and that became so much of a, a mud pile with people just slinging insults at each other, that we moved it to Twitter when Twitter was new. And we thought, oh, we're getting a much higher quality discourse on Twitter. Well, now we laugh at that idea. And Twitter eventually descended into the way we think of it, with, you know, people flaming each other all the time. And eventually we moved to a text message system so that people are sending us their comments. And there's also a lower bar to that, lower bar of entry. Um, you know, than people having to sign up for a Twitter account or a Blue Sky account, or since now people have so self-segregated into Twitter and Blue Sky and other social media apps, how many can we follow at the same time? So we're getting different kinds of input. So we just said, no, we're going to set up a phone number where people can text us. And so that's another thing. Texts are always going by, and we're figuring out which ones to use. So it's what question to ask next. It's responding in real time to whatever the guest is saying or a caller is saying, while at the same time figuring out what caller or what text message we're going to go to next. You know, I'm a big jazz fan, and I take some inspiration from the art form, because one of the things I feel like I'm doing on my show is improv. So hopefully they'll look back and listen to a little bit of the art of it as well.
Before I let you go, Brian, any tips on getting Mamdani or Cuomo to come on this podcast? Curtis Sliwa did it, but I'm missing Cuomo and Mamdani.
They have to think that they're going to get that last vote that's going to put them over the top. By reaching that last listener, you have to appeal. And again, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Rather than appeal to their sense of good citizenship by appearing on the podcast with the, you know, great New York journalist Juan Manuel Benitez, who's going to ask them thoughtful and important questions. It's what's in it for them. And so maybe it sounds like the third place candidate jumped at the opportunity and the ones who think that they're closer to the finish line are playing it closer to the vest.
Brian Lehrer, always a pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for your service.
Juan Manuel, thank you, and keep it up. Thank you for yours.
You can find Juan Manuel Benitez Wants to Know on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Substack, and YouTube. Rate, subscribe, comment, let me know what you think. That's it for this episode. Thank you for watching and listening. I'm Juan Manuel Benitez.